When a client hires you to conduct an impact study, there are a lot of things that you have to juggle. Here is a tip for how to get on the same page quickly with the client so that you can stave off any frustration from you or the client and just make the project more smooth. When planning an impact study, it's helpful to create a study template. And what I mean by a study template is not a document that you would just use to create cookie cutter impact studies. Instead, it's much more like a checklist that you use over and over again to make sure that you're hitting all of the necessary elements and writing about all the necessary elements of a study so that when you do execute the study, you have everything in order. And what I found is that this document proves valuable over and over again throughout the course of your study. So a couple things to keep in mind. My first recommendation would be to complete as much of this document as possible. It might seem like overkill that you might not have to write about all the various elements of a study, even if, especially if the client just wants like a one pager or an infographic that summarizes the results of the study. But the purpose of this document is much more broad, and it's one of the key things is that it helps you and the client get on the same page, which helps the client better understand things like the budget, what they were expecting for you to do, what you were expecting for them to do for you and other stakeholders. And so it's in your interest to have this document fully fleshed out, even if the deliverable ends up being a much slimmer version of all the things that you're writing about. The other thing is, I like to create a draft of this document and share it with the client right away. This is often during the first phase of the project where I'm helping to better understand the budget and expectations of the client. So when I share this right away, the client's able to look at it and go, oh, okay. And then you're able to discuss or identify the pros and cons of doing some of the things that you're spelling out and the implications of it from a cost perspective. Another thing that I like to do is to keep the document fresh. So when a client changes their mind or decides that they want the scope of the project to grow because they want to add more sites to the study, then I go back to the document and then I adjust that section of the document and make sure that the client sees that also, so that it's a completely transparent process. So the key goal is really for everybody that looks at this document and all the stakeholders that should be aware of the project, that everybody has an opportunity to be on the same page. So nobody has thoughts in their mind about what's going to happen in the study that don't align with what's actually going to happen in the study. So the first slide here is about the study questions. So, when you list the study questions, I just try to be as comprehensive as possible. So if the client has 3 key questions that they want to answer, then I write out those questions. And I also try to be specific. So rather than saying something like, did the reading intervention work? Or was the reading intervention effective? I like to try to write it with a little bit more detail, like, did the ABC reading intervention make a significant improvement in the reading skills of students who were below proficiency in the fall? Something like that. Because it's really in your interest to be more specific so that the client understands the question and can say, yes, that is the question. And you can argue about whether or not that's the important question and be on the same page about that, because it's important that you're on the same page about that, because a lot of efforts will flow from how you articulate that question. Another section you want to write about is the target population that you want the results to generalize to. And so if your client is only interested in generalizing the results of the impact study to the clients that they serve, then describing who those clients are. What do they look like? Where do they live? Is it only clients that live in a particular city or have a specific socioeconomic status? Are they only people that live below poverty? Those sorts of things. And also I find it helpful to write down an approximation for the size of that population. The client may not know that off the top of their head, but I think it's helpful to try to do the work of estimating that, because at some point you're going to take a sample and you'll want to have a rough idea of the size of the population to see how representative your sample might be. And so knowing an approximate size of the population can be helpful for that. So related to the population, you want to describe characteristics of the sample. So much of the same stuff as the population, but specific to the sample you intend to collect data on. You want to describe How were they recruited? Were you getting consent from them? Are you collecting data from them via email? How are you getting the list of the sample? If there is some sort of list that you're drawing people from, the approximate size that you want to collect data for. So will you be collecting data on 100 people, 200 people? And then this will help make the case as to whether or not your sample is representative of the population that you want to generalize to. And hopefully it is, because that's important. But being able to write about the same things for the population and the sample will help you and the client become more clear about whether or not the two align. It's also helpful to write about the data collection process. And these are a few things that I like to write about. So what type of data will you be collecting? Will it be survey data? Will it be administrative data that you're going to be getting, like archival administrative data, for example? Will you be collecting data on the ground through a team of data collectors? Will you be using email instead? Will you be collecting the data manually? Also, will you be using specific tools like SurveyMonkey? The tools piece is also helpful because that can obviously have an impact on the costs. And one of the things that I find helpful is, especially if you have several different ways you're collecting data, is to have a calendar, and on that calendar specifying when certain data will be collected, the opening window, the closing window for data collection periods, for a survey or administrative data that you're going back and capturing, that sort of thing. I also like to devote a section to key variables, and this is sort of bridging the gap between the study questions, and the data you're collecting. So in this section, I like to write out the specific outcomes that I'll be using as part of the study to answer, for example, question 1. Let's say question 1 had to do with whether a reading intervention had a positive impact on standardized reading scores themselves and the outcomes, when you're talking about the outcomes. And for each of those outcomes, it's helpful to write out the scale of measurement. Is this like a passed, not passed outcome, so that it's dichotomous, or is it continuous with some minimum value, maximum value, articulating that, and then defining each of those outcomes, and then doing the same thing for the independent variables you'll use and the control variables you'll use. So really fleshing that out in this section. Another piece, and this is actually a piece that you might find yourself using over and over again, the contents from one study to the next might be pretty similar, but it's just having a data management section where you specify how you'll be storing the data, how you'll be sharing it and with whom you'll be sharing it, how you'll secure it, and then ultimately destroy the data. At what date beyond the close of the study will you destroy it, that sort of thing. That's just good practice to have all this information there, especially the data destruction and how it's being secured. And often, if you have a very good rhythm and process for this is something that you can use for lots of studies. Another piece that's important to write about is the study design. And as you know, there are lots of types of study designs, but the differences between them often hinge on attributes of these 3 factors. So the time of the study, if it's cross-sectional, you're only capturing data at one point in time, or maybe you're doing like a pre-post, where you're collecting data before some sort of intervention on a group and then collecting the same data after that intervention for the same group. Another attribute that the study design might hinge on is the control that you're exerting in the study, if it's an experimental design or quasi-experimental, or it's just observational, sort of watching it. And one of the things, watching what's going on and collecting data. And one of the things that, as you know, is that the study design will often be constrained by what the client is comfortable doing, has the capacity to do, and sort of ethics around implementing some control, or for a budget too is a important factor. And so having this information written out is very helpful, because this is one of the things that can have a big impact on budget. And so when you write it all down before implementing, it's a great opportunity to be very thoughtful and get on the same page without having spent a lot of money yet. And then another attribute is the groups. So whether they're just using one group of people, if they've got cohorts, if you're going to have cohorts, or if you're going to have some sort of control group and an experimental group, for example. A lot of those other factors that we just went over will have an impact on the analysis plan. So you might look at this and say, well, I don't really feel comfortable doing something or specifying an analysis plan where I say this is the kind of statistical analysis we'll use for this study question. But if you've done your due diligence and fleshed out all of those details from the other sections, chances are you can give this document to a statistician and they can do this part for you because you've just given them all the information that informs this. You know, when a client comes to me and I help consultants by doing the data analysis for their impact studies and other sorts of studies, but when they give me those details, it's much easier for me to do this and then execute the analyses and write up the results and everything. So don't feel intimidated by this section. If there is a section that you forego because you don't feel like you're equipped to do this, if you hand off all of the other materials to a statistician, they can do this for you because you will have provided them with all the relevant information. And so the analysis plan should map on each of the study questions to the proposed analyses. And I think it's also helpful to specify what the hypotheses are for each of those analyses, as well as the rationale for why you have those hypotheses. So for example, you know, going on with the example that we were talking about before about this reading intervention, ABC reading intervention on the performance of students on a standardized reading assessment, your hypothesis might be that the coefficient for the treatment effect is positive and it's, you know, above some number, and then you could specify why you had that hypothesis. Maybe there's research that suggests that reading interventions like the intervention that you're doing this impact study for showed similar results. Now, I'll be creating videos that break down each of those sections in a little bit more detail, but I always keep a template document with me and I update that on a regular basis. If you want a copy of that so that you can use it for your impact study planning purposes, just shoot me an email here and then I'll send you the latest one that I have. Please just put in impact study template in the subject so I can sort of sift through emails more quickly. I hope this video was helpful, and if you want to see more resources about planning for impact studies or other types of studies for your clients, just visit the link below, www.parsimonyinc.com. Thanks.